I wasn't looking for a missing civilization when I started this investigation. I was researching something far more mundane: the administrative records of colonial-era population surveys. Specifically, I was trying to understand why certain census methodologies from the 18th century were so dramatically inconsistent with one another. Why did British surveyors in one region record population figures that contradicted French surveyors working just a few hundred miles away? Why did Dutch cartographers, renowned for their precision, seem to simply omit entire swaths of inhabited territory from their demographic calculations? These were the small, bureaucratic mysteries I expected to spend a few weeks untangling. I thought I was doing archival housekeeping. Then I found the 1800s census anomaly. It wasn't in one document. It wasn't in one archive. It appeared slowly, accumulating across 3 separate research trips: one to a university library in Edinburgh, one to a digitized collection of Prussian administrative records, and one through a private collection of maps that a retired cartographic historian had been quietly assembling for 30 years. What I found when I placed these sources side by side was not an inconsistency. It was an absence, a structured, deliberate, continent-spanning absence. The numbers didn't add up. They didn't come close to adding up. And when I began tracing the population figures backward, cross-referencing birth records, grain import data, military conscription tallies, ecclesiastical baptism registries, I kept arriving at the same impossible conclusion. There were people, millions of them, documented in records from 1780, from 1790, from 1795, and then somewhere between 1800 and 1830, those millions were simply not there anymore. Not dead, not displaced, not renamed, gone. And the official explanations, when I went looking for them, began to collapse almost immediately. The first place I noticed something genuinely wrong was in a digitized collection of Prussian administrative correspondence held at the Geheimes Staatsarchiv in Berlin. These documents, spanning from roughly 1785 to 1825, include tax assessments, grain distribution records, and population estimates for territories on the eastern and northeastern frontiers of the Prussian administrative zone. What makes these documents remarkable is not what they say, it's what they stop saying. In 1793, a Prussian administrative surveyor named Heinrich Brandt filed a detailed regional assessment for territories east of the Oder River. The document is 47 pages long. It references, with considerable precision, population centers containing what Brandt estimates as no fewer than 400,000 settled persons in a zone that modern historians classify as largely uninhabited at that period. The grain consumption estimates in Brandt's report support this. The road maintenance requisitions support this. The military transit logs, which record the movement of supply columns through the region, support this. The population was there. Brandt measured it, taxed it, and filed 47 pages of evidence that existed. By 1821, a follow-up administrative survey of the same region, conducted under the same Prussian bureaucratic authority, records the area as sparsely populated, largely given to forest and marshland. No explanation for the discrepancy, no footnote, no reference to the Brandt report at all, despite the fact that both documents exist in the same archive, filed under the same administrative territory designation. I contacted an archivist at the Geheimes Staatsarchiv about this discrepancy. She confirmed that both documents were genuine, that both had been authenticated, and that no official explanation for the gap in population records had ever been formally entered into the administrative history of the region. She said it was, in her words, a known gap. Known, and yet not discussed. This pattern, documented population, sudden administrative silence, no official reconciliation, is not unique to Prussia. The Imperial Russian census apparatus, one of the most extensive demographic survey systems of the 18th century, conducted population assessments called revisions at irregular intervals throughout the 1700s. The fourth revision, completed in 1782, recorded population figures for territories in central and eastern Siberia that are, by any demographic calculation, startling. The fifth revision, completed in 1795, records those same territories with population figures reduced by, in some districts, 60 to 70%, not from famine, not from plague, not from any documented military conflict. The grain harvest records from the same territories show no collapse. The trade routes show no disruption. The people should still have been there. The Smithsonian Institution's ethnographic archive contains photographs, daguerreotypes, and early wet plate images dating from approximately 1845 to 1875 of population centers in Central Asia and Eastern Europe that present a profound problem. The architectural scale of the structures in these images is not consistent with the recorded population of those areas at that time. The grain matched, the photographic grain, the chemical signature of the emulsion, which specialists I consulted confirmed predated the technology to fake them by decades. The shadows fell correctly for the latitudes and seasons recorded in the margins. These photographs are genuine, and yet what they show, broad civic avenues, monumental building facades, dense urban infrastructure, doesn't correspond to what we are told was there. The official explanation is that these images document aspirational or symbolic civic projects, that they represent isolated architectural ambitions rather than functioning urban centers. I examined that explanation carefully. I examined it against the scale of the images, against the wear patterns on the stone, against the population implied by the commercial and administrative infrastructure visible in the frames. The official explanation doesn't hold. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The population anomaly doesn't stay in Prussia. It doesn't stay in Russia. That's the part that stopped me cold when I began mapping it. In St. Petersburg, the administrative records of the Imperial Senate contain population assessments for outlying territories that were compiled between 1790 and 1815. The figures are internally consistent within each individual document, but when you plot them against each other chronologically, a step change occurs between roughly 1806 and 1812. A dramatic downward revision of population figures across nearly a dozen territorial districts simultaneously, with no corresponding documentation of the cause. In Buenos Aires, the colonial census apparatus of the Spanish Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata conducted population surveys in 1797 and again in 1810. The 1797 survey records interior territories of what is now Argentina and Paraguay with population figures that historians of South American demographics have quietly struggled to reconcile with the known history of colonization. The numbers are too high. They describe a population density that the official colonization timeline cannot account for. By 1810, those figures have been dramatically revised downward. The census notes attribute this to adjustment for prior survey error. The prior survey error is never specified. In Delhi, administrative records of the late Mughal period and the early British East India Company surveys, both conducted with considerable bureaucratic thoroughness, show the same pattern for territories north and west of the city. Populations documented in the 1780s that cannot be found, either in life or in historical explanation. By the 1820s, the pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The time window is always the same, somewhere between 1790 and 1830. The numbers change. The justifications are always thin. Survey error, reclassification, methodological revision. The geographic range is continental. We are not talking about one region experiencing one crisis. We are talking about a simultaneous demographic correction, if you want to call it that, spanning Russia, Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian frontier, the South American interior, and the Indian subcontinent. The infrastructure is there. The roads built to sustain large populations. The waterworks designed to serve dense urban centers. The administrative buildings constructed at a scale that implies a governing apparatus far larger than what we are told existed. The buildings are still standing in some places. The aqueducts still carry water. Who were they built for? At this point in my investigation, I want to introduce something that many of you will have encountered before and perhaps dismissed, because I nearly dismiss it myself. Tartaria. The name appears on maps from the 1700s with a regularity and geographic specificity that is difficult to explain away, not as a vague ethnic designation, not as cartographic shorthand for unknown territory, as a named, bounded, politically recognized entity occupying one of the largest landmasses on a map of the known world. Not a legend, not a myth, a mapped, administrated, economically documented civilization, French maps from 1705, British maps from 1737, Prussian maps from 1762, Russian imperial maps from 1786. All of them place Tartaria, sometimes called Tartary, sometimes Great Tartary, across an enormous swath of Central and Northern Asia, with divisions: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. These are not decorative labels. Cartographers of that period did not invent populated regions for aesthetic reasons. The labels correspond to trade routes. They correspond to diplomatic correspondence. They correspond to military intelligence reports that reference Tartarian administrative structures as real, functioning governmental entities. And then Tartaria disappears from the maps, not conquered, not renamed, not absorbed through a documented series of military campaigns that we can trace in a historical record. It simply ceases to appear. The maps from the 1820s and 1830s replaced Tartaria with the administrative designations of surrounding empires: Russian, Chinese, British, as if the territory had always belonged to them, as if Tartaria had always been a confusion, a mistake, a cartographic error that the 19th century simply corrected. But here is what becomes impossible to ignore. The timeline of Tartaria's disappearance from the maps corresponds exactly to the timeline of the population anomaly I've been describing. The same window, 1800 to 1830, in which millions of documented people vanish from census records, is the same window in which the largest named civilization on 18th century maps ceases to exist. This is not a coincidence. I arrived at looking for it. This is a coincidence that arrived at me while I was looking at something else entirely. And that is the most unsettling kind. What makes a historical record surrounding this period so strange is not only what the official archives omit, it's what the popular press of the era recorded and then stopped recording entirely. The Caledonian Intelligencer, 1803, a dispatch from a correspondent traveling the eastern Prussian frontier, describes settlements of considerable size, built in a manner unlike any European convention, whose inhabitants speak a tongue unfamiliar to any interpreter in our party. The dispatch runs to 3 columns. A follow-up was apparently filed but never printed. The editorial record of the paper for that period contains a gap of 6 issues that is listed in the archive catalog as lost to water damage. The Philadelphia Gazette of Commercial Intelligence, 1811, a reprinted summary of a Russian Imperial Geographical Survey, describes, in the territories east of the Ural Mountains, a formerly great people whose traces remain visible in the scale of their abandoned infrastructure, though the people themselves have not been seen in the memory of local guides. Abandoned infrastructure, belonging to people who had been present within living memory. In 1811, the London Mercantile Recorder, 1817, a brief item, barely 4 paragraphs, describes a merchant expedition returning from Central Asia that encountered vast halls of stone, clearly civic in purpose, bearing no resemblance to the architectural traditions of any known Asiatic peoples, whose construction must have required a labor force of considerable thousands. The article was not followed up. I searched the paper's subsequent issues for any reference to the expedition's full report. There is none. The Hamburg Handelsblatt, 1819, a maritime insurance dispute references, in its supporting documentation, population centers in the Caspian region that the insurer's geographic assessors list as formerly densely inhabited, now largely vacant, cause of vacancy undetermined. The legal document is matter-of-fact about this. Cause of vacancy undetermined. The St. Petersburg Vedomosti, 1822, a government-adjacent publication that covered administrative news across the Russian Empire, ran a series of 3 articles discussing what the author called the question of the Eastern population deficit, acknowledging explicitly that census figures did not reconcile with prior surveys. The 4th article in the series was never published. The journalist who wrote the first 3 is listed in no subsequent edition of the paper under any byline. After 1820, the pattern is absolute. The reports stop. The dispatches stop. The merchant expedition accounts stop. The census reconciliation debates stop. The Smithsonian's ethnographic collection, which contains hundreds of field reports from the 1870s and 1880s covering territories in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, contains almost no references to pre-1800 population centers, despite the fact that those field researchers were standing inside the ruins of exactly those centers. The absence of reference is itself documented. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the demographic collapse of the early 19th century, the simultaneous disappearance of millions of documented people from census records across Russia, Prussia, Central Asia, South America, and South Asia, was not a collapse at all? What if it was an administrative reclassification, a deliberate, coordinated decision by the emerging bureaucratic powers of the 19th century, the expanding Russian Empire, the consolidating European nation-states, the British colonial apparatus, to simply reclassify an existing population as non-existent in order to claim their territory as vacant and their infrastructure as inherited wilderness? Think about what that would require. It would require census authorities in multiple countries to simultaneously revise their population figures downward. It would require cartographers to redraw maps, removing the political entity those people belong to. It would require the suppression of newspaper accounts, merchant records, and diplomatic correspondence that acknowledge those people's existence. It would require construction of a new historical narrative, one in which the monumental buildings, the engineered waterways, the road networks were attributed to ancient unknowns, to prior civilizations, to Roman or pre-Roman or simply primitive predecessors, rather than to functioning contemporary society. And what would be the motive? Territory, resources, the political legitimacy that comes from being a civilization that built something from nothing, rather than a civilization that absorbed and renamed something that already existed. Why do the census figures stop reconciling in precisely 1800? Why do the maps change in precisely that window? Why does the architectural scale of the surviving infrastructure consistently exceed what the revised population figures could have built or sustained? Why do the newspaper accounts, from journalists in multiple countries, writing in multiple languages, all describe the same encounter with the same abandoned grandeur in the same decade? The evidence doesn't require the supernatural. It requires only an acknowledgement of what powerful administrative systems have always been capable of: erasure. When I began raising these questions in academic contexts, carefully with documentation, with specific archival references, I encountered something that I did not expect. Not debate, not refutation, not even dismissal with evidence. Silence, not hostile silence. That would have been almost reassuring. It would have implied that the question was taken seriously enough to require suppression. What I encountered was something more absolute and, in its own way, more disturbing. Institutional incuriosity. The archivists knew about the gaps. They called them known gaps. Historians of the relevant periods acknowledged the census anomalies when pressed, but declined to engage with them as a pattern. Each anomaly was treated as an isolated local problem: a Prussian record-keeping issue, a Russian survey methodology question, a South American colonial accounting error. They don't debate. They pretend the pattern never existed. It's not active suppression. It's passive erasure. And passive erasure is, in many ways, more effective. Active suppression leaves traces: the burned document, the silenced witness, the redacted file. Passive erasure leaves only absence. And absence, as I've discovered, is very easy to explain away. If you don't look for the Brandt Report, you don't find the Brandt Report. If you don't cross-reference the 5th Russian census revision against the 4th, you don't notice the 60% population reduction that has no explanation. The information is not hidden. It is simply not assembled. And the institutions that could assemble it, the universities, the state archives, the great museums, have organized themselves in ways that make assembly structurally unlikely. When I brought the newspaper archive evidence, the Caledonian Intelligencer, the Hamburg Handelsblatt, the St. Petersburg Vito Mossi series, to a historian specializing in 19th century European press, his response was careful and precise. He said the items were interesting. He said they were consistent with the sensationalism common to commercial journalism of that period. He did not engage with the geographic pattern. He did not engage with the timeline. He did not engage with the fact that the same description, abandoned monumental infrastructure, present within living memory, cause of vacancy undetermined, appeared in publications across 5 countries in a single decade. When I asked about the Smithsonian ethnographic omissions, the response was a referral to a published paper arguing that field researchers in the 1870s were focused on contemporary indigenous practice rather than architectural prehistory. The paper doesn't address why the contemporary indigenous populations that field researchers documented were themselves describing the structures as having been built by people who were present in the time of our grandfathers. Grandfathers, not ancient ancestors. Grandfathers. The pattern exists across disciplines, across countries, across centuries of documentation. And the institutional response to that pattern has been, consistently, to not see it as a pattern at all. There is one more category of evidence I need to address, one that I initially dismissed as peripheral, but that has become, in the course of this investigation, something I cannot set aside: the tools. In the collection holdings of several European and North American museums, including holdings at the Victoria and Albert in London, the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, and the ethnographic collection of the Musée Duque Branly in Paris, there exist agricultural, navigational, and industrial instruments catalogued as having been recovered from the territories in question during expeditions between 1840 and 1890. These instruments are interesting for two reasons. The first reason is their precision. Surveying instruments recovered from Central Asian territories and dated to pre-1800 manufactured display tolerances, the acceptable margin of error in their calibration, that are inconsistent with the manufacturing capabilities attributed to the populations those territories are supposed to have contained. A set of transit instruments recovered in 1867 from a site near what is now the Kazakhstan-Russia border, currently held in a teaching collection in Vienna, was examined by an instrument historian who dated its manufacture to approximately 1780 and noted that its calibration tolerance was finer than anything documented in European manufacture until at least 1820. He attributed this to possible misdating. The instruments were not misdated. Their physical composition has been tested. Their manufacture aligns with 1780. The second reason is their scale. Agricultural implements recovered from the same territorial zones, grain processing equipment, irrigation management tools, land survey apparatus, are consistently scaled for operations far larger than the population figures that have been retrospectively assigned to those territories. You do not build grain processing equipment capable of handling the harvest of 10,000 acres for a population of 300 people. The equipment implies a population. The population has been removed from the record. The equipment remains. Auction catalogs from the 1880s and 1890s list many of these instruments as curiosities of uncertain origin or native implements of unclear function. Museum labels in the institutions where surviving examples are held describe them variously as trade goods, ceremonial objects, or simply agricultural tools, region unknown. The language of the labels performs the same function as the language of the census revisions. It refuses to place the object in a context that would require explaining why it exists. But when you place the instruments beside the census anomalies, beside the newspaper counts, beside the cartographic disappearance of Tartaria, beside the photographic evidence of infrastructure built for populations that the official record says were never there, and suddenly the tool isn't an anomaly anymore, it's confirmation. I keep returning to where I started. I keep returning to the administrative records, the census revisions, the Brandt report sitting in its archive folder 47 pages long, unreferenced by the survey that followed it 28 years later. I keep returning to a simple and devastating arithmetic problem. The numbers that were there and the numbers that replaced them, and the nothing that was ever offered to explain the difference. Why do the population figures across 4 continents undergo simultaneous downward revision in the same 30-year window? Why do the maps change in that same window, removing the largest named civilization of the 18th century with no corresponding military record, no corresponding plague record, no corresponding famine record that could account for the scale of the disappearance? Why do the newspaper accounts, from journalists who had no reason to coordinate, writing in German and English and French and Russian, all describe the same encounter with the same abandoned grandeur in the same decade with the same phrase, present within living memory? Why does the infrastructure that survives in those territories, the aqueducts, the civic buildings, the road networks, the calibrated instruments, consistently exceed what the revised population figures could have built, sustained, or needed? Why did the reporting stop? I don't have definitive answers. I have only questions, and I have the stubborn evidence of pattern. Not coincidence, not random variation, not independent anomalies pattern. A pattern that spans languages and continents and administrative systems and half a century of documentary record. A pattern that the institutions which could explain it have instead agreed, without apparent coordination, to simply not discuss. What we may have lost is not merely a census count. It may be the memory of an entire way of organizing human civilization, one that was present and functional and enormous, and that became inconvenient to the powers that replaced it, and was therefore removed not from the earth but from the record. The earth holds things longer than records do. The earth is less cooperative about revision. The buildings are still there. The aqueducts still carry water. The instruments still calibrate at tolerances that shouldn't have existed when they were made. The stone is still dressed at dimensions that imply a labor force the official history has never acknowledged. They remain patient and enormous in territories whose populations the 19th century decided had never been as large as the 18th century measured. Someone built them. Someone lived inside them. Someone disappeared, not from history, but from a version of history we were given. And I find myself unable to stop asking who decided we shouldn't know.